and welcome to the Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership's Washington Leadership Program. My name is Shama Ahmed, and I am CAPAL's Managing Director. The Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership, CAPAL, is a nonprofit organization that builds Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander public service leaders by providing formative professional experiences and growth opportunities. It is my pleasure to be introducing our Washington Leadership Program with you today. WLP is one of our signature programs that introduces students to AANHPI leaders in public service who can inform and inspire students' own civic engagement. Our WLP theme this year is reflection and resiliency, emphasizing the ability of communities to come together and catalyze momentous change through these unforeseen times. Through these sessions, panelists and attendees will reflect upon events leading up to 2021, emphasizing how communities unite to reflect and demonstrate unyielding tenacity, sorry about that. I think the screen just sort of flickered on me, so one second. Let me just find my notes again. Through these sessions, panelists and attendees will reflect upon leading events up to 2021, emphasizing how communities unite to reflect and demonstrate unyielding tenacity and resilience, even in the face of uncertain and demanding circumstances. All WLP sessions will be recorded and live streamed to our Facebook page and will be available for later viewing. Now I'd like to welcome you to today's session, Google Knows Me Better Than Me, AANHPI Data and Privacy. This session will discuss current data and privacy laws of users, particularly with online platforms such as social media, search engines, news sites, etc. Key topics of discussion include the effects of data collection and tracking, boundaries surrounding online privacy, targeted ads, and disinformation, and effects of increased targeting on user behavior, and the ethics of data ownership. Follow and join our conversation tonight on social media using the hashtag #WeAreCapal and tag us at CapalDC. There will be a short survey that'll pop up after we close out the session, and we greatly appreciate your feedback. With that said, I'd like to begin by thanking all of our speakers and panelists this evening for spending their time with us, and to all of you for joining in. And a very special thank you to our 2021 sponsors for making programs like tonight's possible at CAPAL. Tonight's program will consist of a poll activity followed by a panel discussion and then Q&A. So please go ahead and submit any questions that you have into the Q&A box. And after the Q&A session, we will close out. Now, I am pleased to introduce Hannah, our Programs and Operations Associate, to set the stage for our panel with a poll activity.
All right, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Shama. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our 4th session in our Washington Leadership Program series this summer. We are absolutely so excited to have you here with us tonight. My name is Hannah Park, and I am the Programs and Operations Associate at CAPAL. Before we head into the discussion for tonight, I would like to ask for the audience if you all would like to take a few moments to participate in a quick Zoom poll, which I will launch shortly. And these questions, as you go through these questions are really to serve to introduce and also to gauge your own perspective and opinions about some of the topics that we will be talking about tonight, such as data ownership, privacy, and some of our behavior and tendencies online. I would also like to note that you can answer these questions anonymously. So I will pause here and give a few more minutes for people to fill out the poll, and then I will share the results shortly before we begin the discussion. I would also like to note that if anyone has a question or comment at any point during the webinar, to please submit your questions in the Q&A box. So I'll pause here, give people a few more minutes, and then I'll go ahead and share the results. All right, so hopefully that was enough time to fill out the poll. So I will be pulling up and sharing the results now. So as I said before, during tonight's panel discussion, a big topic that we will be discussing are the perspectives and dialogue around online privacy, data ownership, access to technology, et cetera, and how these phenomena affect the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities specifically. So hopefully these questions reveal something new or surprising about where we're all coming from, and also hopefully give a little insight about who is in the room with us tonight. So going down the questions, as you can see here, what search engine do you typically use? Unsurprisingly, the majority said Google. I am curious to see who said other for that one. For the question, do you know your internet speed? The majority, 65%, said that they do not know their internet speed. I would also be in that party as well. Have you ever bought something from a pop-up ad? 83%, overwhelming majority said no. And then finally, have you ever clicked a privacy policy opt-out, cookie tracking notice, or change tracking preferences? Almost 100%, so 96% of the audience said yes. So hopefully, with all of this information and data in mind, I'd like to hand it off to Shama to introduce our speakers.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that was super interesting, those questions and the responses from that poll. So now the moment we're all waiting for, so please give a warm welcome to Emily, who will be our moderator for this panel. Emily will be leading into the discussion and the Q&A portion. Emily, she is the Assistant Director of Telecommunications, Technology, and Media at Asian American Advancing Justice, where she is responsible for developing and providing public policy research, strategies, analysis, and education on telecommunications, technology, and media diversity. Prior to joining AAJC, Emily worked as a researcher on various projects at the Harvard Kennedy School, including Product and Society at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics and Public Policy, and the Technology and Public Purpose Project at the Balfour Center for Science and International Affairs. Emily received her BA in Legal Studies and Political Economy from the University of California at Berkeley. She received her MPP at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she served as co-chair of the Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus and contributed to the Asian American Policy Review. So with that, Emily, I'm handing it off to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Paul, for hosting this really great panel discussion. As you all are probably aware, issues related to our online privacy and data protections is very important and has been very popular in the news and with legislators, companies. So we have a great expert panel today, so we hope that it's helpful to you. So I'm happy to now take a moment and allow our panelists to introduce themselves. So I'll start with KJ Bongchi.
Hey everyone, my name is KJ Bongchi, and I am currently the Senior Director of Federal Public Policy at the Chamber of Progress. It's a new center-left tech trade association where we're trying to focus on ensuring that progressive values when it comes to consumer protections and so on are upheld in the conversation. Prior to coming to the Chamber of Progress, I was at AAJC and at New America as well, doing tech and telecom work there. At New America's Open Technology Institute specifically, I led a team on consumer privacy and platform accountability issues. But before coming into all this, really my background was in consumer protection and civil rights work. And so I try to bring that lens into this space, and looking forward to today's conversation.
Great, thank you, KJ. Next, we have Tejas Marichania.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tejas Marichania. My official title is the Robert and Nancy Corson Assistant Professor of Law at the UC Berkeley School of Law. So I'm a law professor, and I focus on matters related to telecommunications regulation and intellectual property, and spend a lot of time just thinking about technology and technology policy more generally. So I'm excited to have the chance to talk to you about this particular slice of tech policy and data privacy.
Great, thank you. And last but certainly not least, we have Tazine Khan.
Hi, everybody. I am Tazine. I'm a cybersecurity specialist that's been in the industry for about 10 years now with a focus in program compliance and product architecture. I'm also the founder of an organization called Cyber Collective. We are the first women of color owned data ethics, privacy, and cybersecurity research organization. Our goal is to empower people to critically think about their relationship with the internet while helping them be more secure and private online. I'm very excited to be here among so many incredibly smart people. So thank you for having me today.
Great, thank you all for those introductions. As you can tell, have brilliant panel, lots of experience here. So this is a reminder, if you all have any questions that you'd like to ask any of the panelists during the discussion, please feel free to drop them in the chat because you have the opportunity to hear their thoughts on some of these issues. And it's a really rare opportunity to hear from so many great experts. So first, let's start off with, the title of this panel is Google Knows Me Better Than Myself, which is a little bit alarming, but maybe we can start by explaining to the audience, what is going on the internet and what entities are tracking us and how is that being used against or for all users. And maybe I'll start with Tejas first.
Sure. So, your online activity is being tracked and traced by a wide range of entities. I mean, some of these, I suspect that if you're in this session, some of these you are familiar with and you know about, right? So you're probably generally aware that Google is spending a lot of time thinking about what you're doing online, or that Facebook is spending a lot of time thinking about what you're doing online. And we should dive into that in some more detail, but I think it's also worth situating Google and Facebook in a larger sort of data and personal information context. There are a lot of people that are really interested in figuring out who you are, what demographic you fall in, what your preferences are, and how they can monetize that information about you. So this includes things like credit reporting agencies. This includes things like companies like Axiom that are sort of traditionally developed, traditionally associated with sort of traditional marketing. It includes companies like your internet service providers, so Comcast or Verizon or AT&T. They might be tracking what you're doing online. Many claim to not be. So it's really a wide range of entities, and anywhere you leave a digital trail, whether it's by surfing the web or using a credit card, you're leaving information that's potentially monetized. And that's something that you maybe or maybe not want to be aware of.
Great, thank you. So follow up to that, and this is open to any of the panelists to answer. Can you talk a little bit more about how that information that's being collected about you may be used? Because obviously these companies are saying that there are positive uses to it, and there might be, but also what are the negative externalities that we may or may not be aware of? Okay, I guess we're not in the mood to volunteer, so I'll just call people. I'll go to KJ.
I can jump in. Sorry, I was trying to defer to the other folks. So yeah, quickly, I should give a shout out to CAPAL, the organization. Sorry, we jumped right into it, but it's good to be back with the board, and thanks to Hannah and to Shama for putting this together. Yeah, being legal counsel back in 2013 with CAPAL, I know it's always putting on great programs, so I'm glad to see that tradition continues. I would add on to Tejas's point that it's not just like these sort of major platforms when we think about our data being connected. It's really anything that connects to the internet. So we're talking about Spotify, we're talking about Fitbit, we're talking about ZocDoc, right, which helps you connect with health professionals. So the negative externalities of that is that information, if it's sold to third parties, data brokers who and I think they just sort of talked about this with the credit reporting agencies and collecting that information. I think that's just one major factor we should talk about in this conversation. We're talking about the platforms and their data collection, but if that data is utilized in a way and shared with third parties that kind of scrape the information and then are selling it or giving it, sharing it with other entities, that's when the chance of having any sort of discriminatory impact starts to come into play. And I think that's where, especially for the, AANHPI community, that's where our sort of antenna should be raised in making sure that data collection, we can talk about that, but also like who actually has access to our data and what do the regulations look like in that space?
Sure. So, oh,
Pardon me. I'd also love to add, as we talk about data collection and the onus that we put on the entities that are collecting that data, it's really important to consider, like KJ just mentioned, that entire kind of data distribution ecosystem that exists. And when you're signing up for something and say you accept terms and conditions to an organization that's collecting a certain amount of data, the catch is, they say we share this information with third parties and they are not liable for what those third parties do with that data. And so as the internet is so intertwined and connected that it's becoming harder to regulate the way that this data is distributed within these ecosystems, especially since everybody's kind of volleying the responsibility. And without any kind of legislation right now in place on a federal level, it's kind of allowed for America especially to be called the Wild West of data, because we literally let ourselves do whatever we want with it. But definitely the ecosystem, I think, is super important to acknowledge here too.
thanks, Tazine. That's really helpful. And both of you mentioned a little bit about, the potential for discrimination, how unchecked use of data can be dangerous. But I guess to help our audience understand it more, what are these specific effects that we are wary of, especially as it relates to the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities and other vulnerable communities that might be online and unaware? Because I think many of us are now at the point where we know, when we saw that the audience has already been able to navigate through those tricky cookie notices and things like that. But really at the end of the day, what is the worst case scenario? How are we seeing material harms on the ground at our community level?
Maybe I can jump in with one specific example, and then I'd love to hear about others, but this is just one that comes to mind from your question. So Facebook, so it's a Facebook specific example, and it's an example that Facebook has been sued over. So if I get any of the details wrong, I want to refer you to the actual lawsuit because that's where all the details are right. But essentially what happens is, Facebook can, through collecting a bunch of information about you, can discern can try to discern what they call your ethnic affiliation. So they're not explicitly saying that this is your ethnicity or this is your race, but maybe it's, a race you identify with or an ethnicity that you identify with or some way affiliated with. And they might get a sense of this by, the shows you watch, the music that you listen to, because you've connected Spotify to Facebook. And as they figure out what your ethnic affiliation is, as they get more and more precise about that, they have this information about, right? This is this piece of data. Now, the way that is potentially harmful is Facebook then enables, say, a marketplace. And that marketplace allows some other party, it doesn't have to be Facebook, some other party to decide to list an apartment. And that apartment listing can be targeted by all the information that Facebook knows about you. So now what happens is you potentially have landlords or sellers who are only willing to have their apartments shown to people who have a particular ethnic affiliation, or they can decide to exclude certain ethnic affiliations. So as this sort of information that Facebook gleans from your everyday activity tells it something about your race or ethnicity that is then operationalized to discriminate against you. And that's, I think, one form of the sort of exact pernicious harm that just collecting this data can lead to.
Great, thank you. One of our participants just commented, this is terrifying, which I think is correct. There are definitely concerns about, what we call digital redlining, which is exactly what you just explained, is how discriminatory practices are going to be perpetuated online. And so I definitely want to be wary of that. I'm wondering if any of you in your work with AANHPI communities can speak a little bit to what, KJ, you brought up that we as folks in this community should have our antenna up. What are the specific issues that you've been seeing related to online privacy and data protection that pertain specifically to our communities? Sorry, KJ, that was directed towards
Oh,
you
sorry.
because you brought up
Sure.
our communities portion, but Tazine, I'll go to you next.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think to pick up of like from what they just is saying, I think that is exactly what the sort of like worst case scenario can be. I do think it's important to add though that so that lawsuit, if we're referring to the same one, it was settled right with the FTC, and part of and this goes to another question I think we'll talk about, like what are the companies doing in response. So I'll preview it a little bit, but there are like in those cases where there are egregious violations, the courts or regulators there has been action. And so I think we should definitely spend part of this conversation, maybe in the latter have to talk about like what are companies actually doing in response to a lot of these concerns. I think one of the other areas I know, when doing the work at AAJC was focused on like what ad targeting looks like and how, especially political ads, and when it comes to voting and how political ads could be used in a way to try to discern, to try to like push, AANHPI folks from voting on the correct day or, kind of fear mongering. We've also seen, certain candidates, maybe not necessarily focus on the AAPI communities, but broadly speaking, to sort of use race as a sort of divider and to, target ads in a way to sort of inflame tensions and to, and we saw this again with Cambridge Analytica and some of the sort of activities that Russia and Russian agents were, criticized for inflaming the tensions we have, trying to create division and impacting and trying to influence the outcome of elections. I haven't seen any evidence that this was impacting the AANHPI community specifically. But again, using that data in a way to target our communities is something that we should be aware of.
Right, and some of it can be innocuous too, right? Like YouTube might be recommending videos to folks in our community, or Facebook might be recommending new groups that folks should join based on their interests and what they've clicked on before. But we're seeing that that's been pushing, just like with mainstream users in our community, we're seeing folks maybe move more and more radical to the right and following mis and disinformation sources because of that recommendation. So not all of it might be nefarious on the part of platforms, but we're definitely seeing the effect on our communities. Tazine, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I also wanted to say it's not just the behavior of the larger entities that are collecting this data, but it's the kind of lack of social etiquette and ethics that exist on how we ourselves are participating in the data distribution kind of channel. So for example, you consider undocumented immigrants, and just in New York City alone, there are, and that's where I live, and that's why I'm referencing New York, and within my family, I mean, I came to America on a political asylum, and there are so many people that are walking around that are not, undocumented, but tax-paying individuals in America. And there's this culture of like just taking pictures of strangers. And what people aren't understanding, right? Like CBP just did a deal, I think it was last year, with Clearview AI. Clearview AI is a very kind of provocative tool and like topic of controversy in the industry. Facebook tried to sue Clearview AI, so it's like if Facebook's trying to sue somebody, then there might be a problem of some sort. And this tool, for folks that aren't aware, you take a photo and through facial recognition and just the access that Clearview AI had over time to Facebook's databases and the Friends API, they were able to create profiles on people. And so you take a photo of someone and you can see almost everything that's connected to that individual on the internet. And so Border Patrol is leveraging this tool to identify illegal immigrants. And so I think this entire, just within our community and being children of immigrants and whatnot, it's definitely something to consider, in addition to the different organizations that have these unintended consequences of how they're leveraging our information. It's also within our own actions and agency as well that could be a potential harm without us even knowing.
Right. Thank you. That's very insightful and helpful. And it makes me think about how, there are all these different types of data collection tools being used at the border, but we know that inevitably what's being justified at the border against non-citizens is going to be used by our police, our law enforcement against marginalized communities. So it's really something that we should all concern ourselves with, even if we don't identify as immigrants. So thank you for bringing that side of it up, super important. So I guess that brings me to, what can we even do about it? As first, just as consumers and users, right, before we even go to advocacy, but seeing your example of Clearview and how it's not just mainstream platforms made me think of the example of, there was back in the fall last year, there was an article investigation that came out because an online app directed towards Muslims who could use it for prayer. That data was actually being sold to US military agencies. And so, as consumers who are, on our phones, who are downloading apps that are increasing convenience in our lives, I know my grandmother has all sorts of weird apps that are directed towards like elderly Asian ladies. How can we make sure that our communities and our data is protected just as regular users? Maybe I'll go to Tejas first.
So this is like, it's a complex question and it's a hard one, right? So I think the heart of the question is, how do we protect our data? And there are things like, I mean, maybe KJ and Tazine have better ideas, but I think it's a hard question, because I think we live in a connected society, and I think it's hard for us to give up the conveniences of using your laptop and your cell phone and your credit card. But each one of these things starts to track you. So I think the most basic steps just require you to be diligent about the silly, annoying things that you have to do, right? When you get a privacy notice from your bank that says you can limit what we do with our information, you should take 5 minutes and call the bank and opt out, or you should take 5 minutes to log in and opt out, and you should look at the cookie pop-ups that are on every website and decline cookies to the extent you can. Just doing all of these little things, part of it feels like you're holding up an umbrella in the face of a tidal wave, but they're little things that can help you. And so I think it's worth doing that. Now, whether or not there's I'm kind of sorry to say that I don't have good systematic advice for you as the individual to do something about this. I think the solution will ultimately have to lie in a policy focused solution. I think we're going to need a sort of regulatory approach to really make meaningful progress. And that's in large part because this is not an individual problem. There's lots of, sort of coming from an academic perspective, there's lots of academic literature on sort of how privacy is interconnected and there are privacy dependencies, and how someone else, even if you're doing everything right, if you have a friend on Facebook that does something wrong, as in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, you could get wrapped up into it, because all of these systems are networked and connected. And so because of that, because of the externalities that any one person's behavior can impose on the rest of the ecosystem, what we really need is some sort of regulatory solution. And so, maybe the best thing you can do is call your legislator at the state level, at the federal level, and tell them that this is meaningful and important to you and you want to do something about it. But in terms of your individual privacy, I think it's really important to try to be diligent and exercise, I think, what is sometimes called good data hygiene.
Thanks, Tejas. And what you're saying reminds me of what a privilege privacy is, right? Like we all technically might have privacy rights, and we all technically might have access to a privacy policy and those cookie notices, but in practice, it takes, a certain level of education, a lot of leisure time, English speaking ability, and all of those things to actually be able to opt out and practice. And, actually going to every single data broker and seeing if they have data on you takes a lot of time. And so it often feels like a right that is only exercisable by the most privileged in our society, which is an equity issue in and of itself. I guess that leads me to, you mentioned there has to be change, and we have to be calling our legislators and other advocates. So maybe if you could provide some information about today, what does the landscape look like? What does enforcement look like? KJ, you brought up, the FTC and some of their work, but what does enforcement against these practices look like today? And where are some of the gaps? So I'll go to KJ next.
Sure, thanks. So I do want to take a step back, and maybe I should have done this at the start of the conversation, just seeing all the comments from our participants talking about how scary everything we're saying is. I do think all of the harms that are being raised are definitely real, and they should be taken seriously. But I do want to make 3 quick points and then talk about the legislative landscape. The first is that when you ask consumers, overwhelmingly, like, when you say, do you like your personalized services? Do you like the fact that Google Maps can break down like what, how to avoid traffic, or ZocDoc can give you like doctors in your area that you need to see immediately? Their answer is always like, majority, like folks are like, yes, we love personalized services. That is, I'm not trying to like gloss over the conversations about data protection at all, but I'm just saying like consumers do appreciate it. The second thing is that smaller companies do rely on data to have their services become like much more relatable and usable. And there's a whole industry that is very focused on that. But the third point is that as AANHPI communities, like we shouldn't be anti-data, right? Like our communities are diverse. There are subgroups. And when it comes to issues such as language needs or access needs, to say completely to be anti-data, I think kind of like I hate the idiom, but throws the baby out with the bathwater, right? Because it's like we do want our products, and especially our technological products that we are utilizing, to actually be able to reflect who we are. And when I was at New America, I wrote this report called Equity by Design that showed all these examples where there were tech products that were coming out that did not take into consideration the feedback from our communities or have folks who look like us on this panel, like in the room. And so the result was to either, completely like keep us out of the conversation, or the practice in collecting data was something that was done in a like dehumanizing way. And so I do think that it's important to understand that, look, we should talk about data protection, and I'll be responsive to your question now about what the legislative landscape looks like. And I do think they just sort of highlighted some of the complications. Right now, statewide, I think we have 3 states, California, Virginia, and Nevada, that have consumer legislation, consumer privacy legislation. Nevada's legislation looks a little different from Virginia's, and California's, I would argue, is probably the most sort of like comprehensive. They sort of they passed something in 2019, 2018, and then they just recently had an update to it. They just had another sort of ballot initiative. So right now you only have 3 states out of 50, and then you have the territories. So again, not looking great. And privacy, the way, and Tazine actually referenced this a lot, that privacy in the US is very sectoral, right? We treat finance privacy a certain way, health privacy a certain way. We even have a law for children's privacy and what that looks like online. But in terms of consumer protection, we still don't have much. And I do think the complication starts becoming around the idea of like, how are we going to take on some of these difficult issues? Who is actually going to be a covered entity? How are we going to define that type of company? Are we going to define it by revenue? Are we going to define it by consumer like time? Is it going to be about the actual, focused on the time that users are spending or the number of users you have as a platform? And so we see multiple federal pieces of legislation come out that takes very different approaches. There's no universal agreement there. And so I think that is like the basic area. But then we have to, as AAPI communities, we have to think through what are the basic fundamentals we want in privacy legislation. And this is just kind of enhance Tejas's point about calling your members of Congress or your state legislators, that's great. But to say, look, we want a privacy bill that gives us a right to access, that gives us a right to correct information about us, that gives us right to delete it. We want the ability to have data portability. I want to be able to move my information from one to another and have that ownership of it. And also to have clear indications of what does transparency look like? Like what obligations does the company have to tell its users like what your rights are on their platform? Again, there's a lot of disagreement about what that transparency reporting actually looks like. And so I do think, we came close to, we had a few draft bills come out, I believe in 2019, with the spread of, COVID that kind of took away all the attention from Congress. And now the attention is back on infrastructure. So the chance for us to talk about privacy legislation is still, we're always going to have that opportunity. But I would just say that it's important for us to be in that conversation, that to just step back and be like, look, I know my digital rights, so I'm okay. I don't need to worry about this. It's important for us to actually engage with with the actual process to ensure that our communities are actually represented in whatever final outcome there is.
I would love, oh, go ahead, Emily. I'd love to add on to both what Tejas and KJ said. So in the beginning, it was mentioned, right? Like there isn't much that an individual can do. I would say that I agree and disagree with that comment, right? I think that, yes, there is so much regulation and responsibility that the government needs to take charge on, and there's not much that we can do as an individual to get the policies in place, right? There are other people that are working on this, but if you think about the American government and the systemic injustices that are in place, I for damn sure am not going to wait for the government to put in policies on my behalf, because I don't have trust within the systems that are already in place. So I think a few things that individuals can do right now to make themselves more private or more secure on the internet are important. And I don't have to dive into them right now, but if you go on to Cyber Collective's website, you go on to resources, we have an entire breakdown on exactly what you can do today as activists, as immigrants, as children of immigrants, to make sure that you're secure online and private. I think the second piece that really spoke to me as well with like the different regulations that perhaps like do and don't exist, right? There are bills that are being passed right now, I think within like Florida, Virginia, and a couple of others. And there are dichotomized kind of like bills that are being passed to help with specific elements around privacy, but privacy is very, very different than consumer data protection. And I think that that is a distinction that isn't often made in industry because right now, I mean, CCPA, great regulation in California. Proposition 24 was a little fishy, with the opt-in, opt-out elements. And so I know we're going to talk about digital divide and kind of like that socioeconomic divide today, but I think that allowing ourselves to believe that somebody else is going to do the research, critically think, and give us guidance, and that the government is going to handle it, to me is not an answer or a solution, right? I think we do that on our own. And so it's on our own like best interest to try to start dialogue and try to critically think about the processes that are in place, and then what we can do to kind of take ownership and control into how our own behavior can affect this entire kind of larger dynamic. Because, the government, I mean, not that I love all of the different regulators, policy builders and whatnot that are in place, but they're not moving as quickly as the technology is moving, right? And so that's where we have to come in and take ownership of our own decisions, essentially.
Right. I think we've all seen the congressional hearings. where the senators and representatives are kind of struggling to keep up with the rate of technology. And so I think you're right that even if folks on the Hill had the best intentions, they might fall short, and there's more that we need to do. I think, Tejas, I think I might have cut you off a little bit, sorry.
Oh, I wanted to add one thing, because I think KJ said something that was really important, and Tazine, I think you echoed it too, which was, this idea that like some of these stories are scary, but there's also a lot of real value that's generated from these systems. And I think that's absolutely right. And so this, I think, ties back to the question of policymakers. And there's just one thing that I wanted to add, which was, so I think it's right that these stories are scary. And I think it's right that what we want is we want policymakers and potentially regulators to intervene whenever they're able to and whenever they're capable. Because right now, I think like there is real value and there are also real harms. And the entities that are making the choice between those trade-offs are not you, and they're not your representatives. The entities that are currently making that choice are largely an industry. And I think that's what we should be most concerned about, is that it's this sort of institutional arrangement and the question of who decides. And so I think the most important feature of this is whatever the privacy rules end up being, whatever the trade-off ends up being between the value of the data and the privacy, you want that decision to be made by an entity that's ultimately accountable to you in some respect. And I think that is, to me at least, what's most disappointing about our current framework.
Right. So that's a great transition. You mentioned that, the people who are making decisions, it shouldn't be them, but right now it is the tech companies and the folks who are collecting the data have power over the data. So I guess that leads me to two questions, which is first, in an ideal world, then who should own the data and what would data ownership look like? And then two is, what are companies doing today in response to the heightened criticism about their data practices, and what could they be doing better? So I will go to, I'm going to go back to Tejas.
Okay, I'm going to try to be quick. So in terms of what data ownership looks like, I don't think I think data ownership is the wrong way to think about this. I don't think we want to think about this in terms of personal ownership of data, because as I said, all of this data has spillovers. It's all interconnected. And so rather than thinking about you owning your own data, I think, but we want to think in terms of trade-offs and sort of what we want to allow certain entities, right? Whether it's size, whether it's industry, in what industries are companies allowed to use what data for what purposes. And that's like, it's a paradigm of protection rather than a paradigm of ownership. So that's how I would think about it. And I think the way to operationalize that is to have, agencies, things like the FTC or things like the FCC that have expertise that can take time and craft rules, but are maybe one step removed from Congress or one step removed from the president, accountable to them for sure, but still also able to exercise some expertise within an environment of political influence.
Right. And KJ, you started to talk a little bit about how companies have been responding to the concerns about these issues. Could you tell us a little bit more about how they've, maybe created new entities or changed their practices, and where they have been successful, and we should be celebrating those wins, but where there remain gaps that need to be addressed?
Sure, yeah. I do want to plus one what they just mentioned about, just before I go into what companies are doing. I think I love that idea of this framework. There needs to be a shift in terms of thinking about, is it really about data ownership or is it about data protection? I would pile on top of that and say, I think it's also about having, personal agency over our data. And I think that's why some of the principles I talked about, the right to access, correct, and delete, being able to port your data from one platform or to another. I think that those are critical conversations to have in the legislation piece. On the company side, so so they just referenced the lawsuit that Facebook went through, and the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission settled, and Facebook entered into what's called a consent decree, where they basically had to lay out like this is what they're going to do in terms of restitution for what they got in trouble for. And so part of that like consent decree was creating this table of privacy experts, folks from civil society who would essentially advise Facebook on any new product or policy that they put out and give them feedback on a privacy perspective. And so when I was at New America, the Open Technology Institute, I sat on that roundtable. And so you can see the struggle for the way that Facebook specifically, I can talk to them about their work specifically, is that they do have a whole risk mitigation team. They have a whole privacy risk mitigation team that tries, as they're thinking through policies and products, they're thinking about how do we empower the user to do it. And you see the questions that they struggle with, right? So if you're on the platform and you want to know what your privacy rights are, if you're on the the web app, do you create a small movie? Do you make it 3 clicks to get there? Do you make it 4? And so it's not that, I understand there's, no company is perfect, and there's ways to go to gain some of that sort of trust that was lost with Facebook specifically. But internally, I have seen that there has been efforts to try and to make it easier for the user to understand. You see this with Google, where with the Gmail, if you have a Gmail account, they'll send you, especially recently, you've been getting more emails saying, hey, it's time for a privacy checkup. Do you want to click through and see what you're doing? So from my perspective, what I'm seeing, the company response is to focus on user empowerment. Now, in terms of like what companies should be doing, I would argue that there needs to be, a sort of broader, and I'm not just going to focus on Google and Facebook. I'm going to include, Apple, Amazon, Spotify, all the companies that are collecting data and trying to create a personalized service for you. There needs to be a mindset of risk mitigation and data minimization, right? And that principle of data minimization is focusing on the idea that you only use enough data to actually serve the function that you're trying to produce for the consumer. That the idea that you're collecting more data outside of it, and there's the story that like I've told on these panels in the past is that there was a flashlight app that was collecting location data. Why would your flashlight app ever need to collect that type of data? And where does that information go? So there was obviously concerns like that, and I do think that there is an effort to try and give consumers the more, a feeling of being more empowered. But I would say that's I don't think that's far enough. And, and I totally respecting what Tazine is saying about, look, we can't rely on regulators and the government. And I agree with that. We can't wait for government to take action. But I will say that there needs to be some sort of baseline rule that all companies need to know, and for the consumer to know, hey, look, this is a law on the books and you guys violated this. I have the right to, to seek some sort of retribution or to ensure that this can be corrected. There has to be a baseline rule. And so while, that's just the drum I'll keep beating in these conversations, is that baseline privacy legislation is needed, and states, it's great that they're kind of picking up the ball and running with it, but that I don't think in the long run that's going to do much for consumer confidence or education when your rights are different based on what, where you are geographically.
KJ, I really appreciate the point you brought up about the need for data minimization within companies, because it reminds me that there needs to be a cultural change even within the companies too, because for so long we've been talking about how more data is better, how data is the new oil, and unless we see a change from within the companies, that type of rhetoric and mindset is only going to continue and make things worse. I used to actually, at the beginning, Tejas brought up Axiom, the data broker company, and I actually used to work there. And one of the things that we try to do to create cultural change is we tell the engineers and product managers all the time, we'd say, pretend, and you don't even need to pretend because it will actually become this way. remember that you're handling your mother and your grandmother's data. You know, how much do you want the world and the companies and these agencies and governments to know about the personal private life of your mother? So I think part of it is just remembering there are real people behind the data. And I think, Tazine, you brought up the point, just really powerful earlier, that it needs to be a society changing to take better care of each other. I want to make sure, Tazine, you have a chance to add as well from your perspective. What do you see as the necessary changes that need to be made within the tech sector?
Yeah, everything that both Tejas, you, Emily, and KJ said, I completely, I agree with. And this is all it's all pretty subjective around how we think the ideal circumstances should and could be. From my perspective, personally, I think one of the biggest lacks, at least, and the solution that, Cyber Collective is trying to kind of solve is this gap between the tech industry making changes, consumers being affected by it, and them not necessarily understanding what is going on, right? So it's not that data ownership, even if consumers had full data ownership, they probably wouldn't know what to do with it, maybe, or perhaps feel overwhelmed, but with the responsibility that comes around ownership truly could mean. But I think from my perspective, the biggest is just allowing people to give their perspective and opinion. And, at Psycho, we call them research events. We have one tomorrow where we are breaking down the bills that are kind of in place right now within legislation related to privacy laws. And our biggest thing and approach is to help people critically think, like I said. So we share technical information and we let people know, like, hey, this exists. Through that process, we then kind of assess, like, do you understand what we just said? Like, would you be able to talk to your parents or your grandparents about this information? And then we ask, like, okay, now that let's say a topic was around algorithmic bias, right? And content filtration on social media. And we asked our attendees, like, now that you understand what this means, do you want to change your behavior? How do you feel? What are these narrative-based insights? And I think the biggest gap right now is that there are just a lot of different people with opinions, right? Like academics, people in the field, right? People that have lived experiences that aren't in the field. And regulators are working on some incredible policy, and people that really genuinely care on the Hill about consumer data protection, and just folks in industry, all of us at this panel. And I think it's just asking people, right? Like, what do you want? But asking them after they have the opportunity to really learn and understand what it means and all of the work that we're doing. So ideally, I would love to say that people would have ownership to their data, but I think that that's a responsibility that people don't necessarily really want right now, from at least my experiences. And the last thing I'll add, because I know we're running out of time. I'm not sure if I cut out or my computer froze. Can you guys
No,
still
it's
hear
a
me?
little slow, and you're frozen a few times, but we can still hear you.
Okay,
Okay,
is
so
it better now?
yes,
without
we
the
can hear
video?
you. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, I lost my train of thought, so I will just leave it there. Thank you.
Great. No, I think you brought up a lot of really important points. I love that you talked about community-based solutions. I think digital literacy is going to be really key. And that brings me to one last question. KJ, you've talked about how it's important that our voices are included in the process, not just for making laws, but also building the technology. And seeing you've brought up why it's so important to include the community in that process. But we've been talking about how to protect ourselves from data collection, what needs to change, all this. But at the end of the day, it is a tool that is necessary for our society and community to survive and thrive. So as we're thinking about the effects of COVID and folks who are left behind by the digital divide, can you think of solutions that we can start to implement to increase access on multiple fronts, right? To online tools, to digital literacy, to to actually exercising the privacy rights that everyone should have access to. How can we increase access for our communities, in the AANHPI community? And if you could also include some maybe closing remarks before we go to participant Q&A. I'll go back to you, Tazine.
I would say that a lot of the resources do exist, and there are so many incredible organizations that are working day in and out to make sure that these resources exist, but they have to reach the mainstream spaces where people are, right? Like I went through some of Tejas's incredible academic articles today, right? How many day-to-day consumers are going to look up academic scholarly articles for information though? I'm sure many will, but most probably won't. So the approach that I think is really necessary is allowing organizations and the tech industry to align the way that people are receiving information, which is through social media, which is through memes and pop culture. And so that's why our organization, we share a lot of content through the platforms that we're talking about today, which is Instagram and Twitter. We don't have a Facebook, but putting information in the spaces where people exist, where everyday people exist, and making sure that our approach is simple. We're not using legal jargon. We're not using freaking buzzwords to describe things, but just in simple, plain language so that folks understand this exchange that they're making online. And it's, I think, as simple as that. And a few tips and I guess information, and my last closing remarks is that this is scary. There's a lot that is happening in the world, but there are really, really great, dedicated and brilliant people that are working to make sure that these gaps and these voids are filled, but we need everyone's help to do so. And if you are energized to have conversations with people about the importance of this, I would say, please do so, because it's having the conversations that are going to not only help us make change, help legislators, help policy builders, but also allow for your opinions to be, heard and leveraged to build better technology in the future. And just thank you for having me today.
Great. KJ, same question.
Sure. I think Tazine covered everything I was going to say. So I'll just say, I think that, the folks who are funding this type of work out there, whether it's foundations, individual donors, who what have you, I do think more of that work that builds narrative into like data needs to be enhanced, right? I think there just needs, and because I agree with the concept that data affects all of us, right? The minute you walk out into the street and there are street cameras or whatever, right? Like data is being collected on you, on your body. And there's an amazing organization called Data for Black Lives that did, a number of narrative collection, and through the Ford Foundation, they brought in, when I was at AAJC, I was there. They brought in folks from the Latinx community, the African-American community, LGBTQ community, from folks from the disability rights community. And we just sat and like talked about like stories in our own community, but like, what was the next step, right? Like, did that make its way into policymakers? Did it make its way into sort of the mainstream? So now corporations are like, oh, like we need to like be responsive to this, or say something about this. It didn't happen. So I think that's the one thing I'd call on is, obviously this is not the audience that's going to be like big funders, but I do think folks here can help amplify when they see this work. And I think I would encourage everyone to really push their narrative and make privacy something that's like a lot more conversational instead of something where folks are like, oh, privacy, what this like nebulous topic. My closing sort of thought is this, like, this is a difficult topic because the ecosystem, you change one part and it impacts something else. And I'll say just, referencing the FTC consent decree that they just talked about earlier. So as a result of that, Facebook became much more careful about sort of data mining on their site. And so there's this organization called the NYU Ad Observatory that was trying to collect data on on political ads, trying to figure out like who is purchasing political ads on Facebook and what is the impact, and just trying to, be critical of Facebook's sort of ad targeting processes. And, Facebook shut them out completely. And their response was, well, yeah, because we got in trouble for this with the FTC consent decree. We had this whole Cambridge Analytica thing. And so the result was to like swing aggressively the other way. So when you have researchers who are actually trying to do good work in this space and trying to help create narratives and help explain to like a larger public, like, hey, this is why you should be concerned about certain practices on a platform. Well, because there's scrutiny. And again, there's no baseline legislation to be like, look, here are the rules you need to play by. And by the way, there's a carve out for researchers, right? That's something that some legislation has done. So I'd say that the topic is complex, but I think it's on us to sort of demystify it and to try to find ways to, get involved in the process of whatever final product legislatively like comes out, but also just enhancing literacy, right? Talking to your parents about like, look, don't just hit accept cookies, right? Like actually like understand what it is you're saying. View things in private mode, use DuckDuckGo, right? There are like there are opportunities and products out there that allow you to be more privacy enhanced. But also if you want the personalized products, like, finding a way to like to also utilize that in a safe way.
Yeah, I love that point you made at the end. At our family Thanksgiving, I make everyone get out their phones and I walk them through their privacy settings and make them like turn off the tracking, turn off the geolocation for certain apps. I'm like, yeah, like, does this flashlight app really need your geolocation, grandma? No, like, let's turn it off. So that's what's necessary, is the people-to-people connections. And Tazine, you brought up like trusted messengers. I think it's important. Like, we are the trusted messengers for our community, so it's on us to do more. So to close it out, last but not least, I'll turn it to you, Tejas.
I don't think I have anything to add. I'm an academic. I'm not an activist. I'm not an organizer. So I think the advice that Tazine and KJ have for how to do this is really good advice. I guess the only thing, the few things that I'll echo very briefly is, one, talk to your friends and family, because that's really important. If data is viral, so can your stories, and so you should do that. I also want to reiterate the call to reach out to your policymakers. There's, I think, a tendency to think to be skeptical of that and to think that it not works, but legislators and lobbyists rely on the fact that people have this view. And so if you're motivated enough to reach out, sometimes a legislator or a staffer will take notice. And if you're willing to dedicate, leisure time that you have to do that, people will pay attention. And so it's worth doing. And I want to reiterate that you should do that no matter where you fall on this spectrum, right? If you're someone who thinks that no one should collect any data about me ever, and I just want to live in a log cabin in Vermont, that's fine. If you're also someone who, our community includes people that work at Google and Facebook and that have a stake in this and think that this is good for society and more value enhancing than it is problematic, you should make that case too, because ultimately, like I said, this is about figuring out a democratic solution, and that means we need sort of plural voices to get to the right answer.
Can I have one quick point, Emily? I was going to say folks should also look up the work of the Cyber Collective and AAJC, because they both are doing a lot of important work in this space. I know AAJC has a whole dedicated tab to telecom and tech work, and so as it relates to our community, so definitely check that out. And of course, read Tejas's amazing scholarly writings as well.
Sneak into a class where you get to listen to him all the time, absorb his wisdom. Thank you all. I promised you a panel of intelligent, insightful experts, and I think we got exactly that. I'll thank you for your powerful words, your experience, for sharing all of that with us. So I think we'll be moving on to audience Q&A. There are quite a few interesting ones here. So I guess I'll start with one, which is, where where did it go? Okay, the one, we're talking about, we are in the same community. We're all AANHPI. Some of us might have family overseas and are, yes, concerned about the mainstream platforms that affect us in the United States. But what about apps like WeChat or other things abroad that might also be affecting our families? How can we understand the risks that are there? And is there anything that we can do to protect the privacy of our family members who might be using these apps overseas or, even here locally? I'll open it up to anyone who has thoughts.
I'll just jump in real quick. So so this is like complete personal experience, taking off my work hat and all that. So in the Desi community, WhatsApp is huge. And I think literacy about not just privacy, but also a lot of misinformation, right, gets sent, where it's like these random graphics saying like Facebook's going to start charging people $5 unless we all like sign this thing, So I think, again, like the literacy piece is critical, and even more so if it is apps that like your own family is using. And so for me, yeah, it was, calling my mom and be like, Mom, you need to stop spreading, like you're literally like the person who is spreading disinformation in our family about like voting or what's happening in India, right? And then like, this is not like the best way to spread this information. I know the company tried to stop the amount of times you can forward information as one way of trying to combat it, but nothing beats like, like a son or daughter calling up their parent and just being like, hey, like we need to like figure out like, on the disinformation front.
Yeah, I think sometimes we have to nag them the way they nagged us, like very lovingly, but very consistent, tireless. I'm thinking about, it's not just messaging apps. I know there's a very popular Korean American mom blog, like Reddit type website, where there's all types of mis and disinformation. And I had to sit my mom down and talk about what's a reliable source versus what's not. Like, how do you trace back to the source? So those are two examples. Tazine, Tejas, do you have any examples? Okay, we can move on to another question then. So Carmen asked, can America get our own GDPR? So I think this is something a lot of folks who are concerned about their privacy ask, but I'll add to that question, is GDPR the solution? Has it improved privacy and actually given people meaningful access to their rights with its implementation in Europe?
I will just quickly say, in my research in the past, I learned that, GDPR, a lot of it came like in the aftermath of World War II and coming into the digital age. Legislators in Europe, they kind of made sure that data laws were strict in order to prevent something like that from ever happening again. And that data privacy, in fact, like was an underlying principle of the European Union to like make sure that they look at data violation as a violation of human rights. And in the States, we're still trying to figure out if the government really understands the human rights everybody's fighting for. And so there's kind of that large discrepancy, I would say, in a sense. And there's just a really dichotomized approach. And I'm not saying GDPR is the answer, but I do really appreciate the union behind it and kind of like the approach that they took, which I am seeing within the privacy community and coalitions that I'm a part of, which is amazing, especially with the new chair at the FTC. I forget her last name is Khan. I forget her name. There are just a lot of people that are working really hard, but I don't know that we'll have a united approach because I don't know that there's a lot of agreements on the state level around our regulations right now. So, and please, KJ, Tejas, add your perspective to this.
I'll just quickly say, yeah, privacy is definitely cultural as a concept. I think minority communities view privacy a very different way than like the majority, right? Like non-POC communities do. I think Europe, and yes, exactly. The World War II reference is great because that's exactly what caused and has, created a lot of sort of more urgency, I would say, in the EU to like try to focus on online privacy a lot faster than the US. So I think the answer is yes, we will have our own version of GDPR, but I hope it's better. We haven't talked a lot in this conversation about the impact it's had on smaller businesses. I know CCPA had a huge impact on smaller businesses. So we're talking a lot about big tech, and that's important, right? Like to scrutinize big companies, big tech companies, but thinking about like, you know, actors who have like a good idea and are like, cool, I will really want to like, I can benefit society, but it is like hard to even get out the gate because of like this XYZ requirement. So I think we do need something that is all inclusive our community, but also protects us from on the consumer level.
Right. And I will pretend I'm a panelist for a second and add my own thoughts on this. You know, a lot of people compare the CCPA to GDPR, and a lot of the principles included in that California piece of law is modeled after GDPR. But, you know, it brings us back to, you know, for our communities and other communities that are not as privileged or maybe marginalized, does having a law on the books actually give them the ability to access their digital rights? And I say with California, the answer currently is no, because if you try to click on a cookie notice, which apparently many of you have, and you have to read through, you know, pages and pages of legalese in English, which you're not fluent in, you know, you're not really able to exercise your rights. So I think whatever form the privacy, you know, legislation that we end up adopting or not adopting ends up being, what's more important to me than the technical details is, you know, how are communities that need the protections the most actually going to be able to access and exercise it. So that's my little soapbox spiel before I go to the next question, which is, I think there's a new interesting trend of thinking about like compensating people for their data. So one of our attendees asked the question or made a comment about how in their state, their legislators are introducing a bill about compensating people for data that is collected about them. So I'm curious to hear if any of you have thoughts on that model that's being proposed.
I'll just say flatly, absolutely not. I hate the concept of pay for privacy. And I think you referenced earlier how privacy is already, you know, a product of privilege. And so now on top of that, to be like, well, only the, you know, X percenters get to like have their privacy protected while everyone else gets to have their data sort of shared around and thrown around. Like I would, yeah, I'll just say flat out, I would oppose that model.
Well, I also agree, for the record, but I think it is a model that is gaining steam. I know for a while Amazon was offering gift cards if folks opted into certain things, and a shocking and disturbing number of my friends and family members opted in. So that's another +1 for it has to be community level, has to be you explaining and when necessary nagging your community. So I think we're right about out of time. So I'm gonna hand it back over to the folks at CAPAL, or maybe we're not out of time. Oh, we're good on time. Okay, I think there's an interesting question here. So leaving, you know, the data brokers and online platforms, that type, social media, that world, and thinking a little bit outside of that, we have a question about media. So the question is, have you seen any Orwellian type control of the media by the government, which I think relates to some of the topics that we've touched on today. So curious to hear about, you know, more generally, maybe what's the effect of media? How does that maybe tie into some of the mis and disinformation issues that we mentioned before? And if you see any ties back to online privacy issues.
So I could talk a little bit about this one. So I think it's actually, it's a really, the framing of the question is clever, but I think it's a really hard question. So it depends on what you think about, what you define as media and what you think of as Orwellian control. So let me give you an example, right? So there's, WhatsApp is big in the Desi community. There's a story from a few years ago about how there are these doctored viral videos that are being forwarded around in India about these kidnappers, but they're not really kidnappers, and then ends up that like a dozen people end up being murdered because of mobs that are worried about kids being kidnapped. So on the one hand, you have this this fear of disinformation on messaging apps. And maybe we want something like content moderation to help deal with that. On the other hand, you have Verizon is in charge of Verizon text messaging infrastructure, and an abortion advocacy group wants to send text messages to its supporters about abortion advocacy. And Verizon says, this content is too controversial. We're not going to let you send it. And so, what you have are these sort of like really different competing ideas about sort of like what type of media and what type of content you want distributed over these communications networks. And again, it comes down to sort of who decides and who you trust to decide. So do you trust the government more than you trust Verizon? And I don't have an answer for you. I think that's a hard question. I mean, I think in America we have First Amendment limits on what the government can really do. But if you set the First Amendment to one side and just try to think about, so from first principles, who would I rather have control over communications between me and my family? Is it Verizon or is it the government? I mean, the answer is not obvious to me. And so I think we see examples of control. Those examples tended not to come from the government, but there are examples in India, for example, of trying to crack down on things like WhatsApp and Signal in ways that, for law enforcement purposes, that are sort of distinct from the example that I raised at the beginning. But I think it's a hard question. I think the trade-off between disinformation and censorship is one that we're going to have a lot of trouble figuring out over the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Mm-hmm. So you've brought up censorship as one of the concerns we may have about on the government side, but we also have a question here that says, what do you think about the NSA and what Edward Snowden did to expose privacy abuses by governmental intelligence agencies? So that's like a different part of what we're discussing, right? Is what we've talked about, how government can play a role in helping to improve enforcement and give us better rights. But what if government is the one that is violating, or depends on who you ask. If you ask me, it's violating our privacy. What are your thoughts on this?
I'll just quickly say, I think, so we focused a lot on like big tech today, and that's as we should. I think, and we talked a little bit about data brokers and the role they play. I think, and we focused a lot on the consumer side and about what big companies can do and cannot do. I think there needs to, in that conversation, also be like, what are the government limits in interacting with data brokers? And so the story you referenced, Emily, about apps that were focused on the Muslims looking for a place to pray, or even Muslim dating apps, right? Where information was collected on individual users and then given to the FBI. It was a workaround the Fourth Amendment. So I think, again, like we have, yes, like in the US, we do have our Bill of Rights and we have a constitution, but still the government has found ways to circumvent that, to still play in a surveillance kind of role. And so while consumer protection is important and putting limits on the private sector is important, when it comes to our data, we can't forget that there is a whole surveillance aspect engaging, and we're seeing, they just referenced like how like foreign entities are doing that, right? They're using Facebook as a way. So when major big tech companies, Google, Facebook, put out transparency reports, part of their transparency reports each year is how many requests by government entities have you had in the past year, where they talk about the number of times a police officer or police agency has asked for information, or a federal agency. So the point is, it's important to talk about big tech companies and the regulations there, but we can't forget the interaction that government also has with the private sector and the limits there.
Great. And Tazine, maybe you could add a little bit to that. I know you talked a little bit about, what Customs and Border Patrol are doing related to surveillance as well.
Yeah, there's a huge, right, like tech border industrial complex, and there are people that are way more well-versed around this. There's the Mi Gente Foundation, and I forget the name of the other organization, but I can share it, and hopefully the folks at CAPAL could share this information afterward as well. But there are organizations right now that exist to kind of counter the regulations that are being pushed in place to help with consumer protection and privacy, that may be advantageous. Is that the right word? Not advantageous to tech companies. And they're working day in and day out. They, against antitrust. I mean, I think Facebook's antitrust or one of their, I haven't been keeping up with it lately, but someone's case was dropped recently. And there are private entities and companies that exist that are trying to continuously counter the good that potentially is happening. But there is a huge play between private entities and the government, with very kind of limited regulation around how those entities will choose to work with the government, essentially, and limited insight from people to be able to share like what they actually want in the process and within the exchange. But I think that, a lot of people are working to make technology to be like a force for good at the end of the day, right? And I think that it is our job to continuously investigate and mitigate the risks that might exist potentially between these relationships. But yeah, that there's you could go into the entire kind of like surveillance industry that exists right now, and it's private, right? And how they're working at the border, they're working with just prison systems and whatnot. So I think that's an entire like deep conversation that would make for its own conference essentially too. But there's just a lot of nuance within the subject within itself.
Right. Thanks. And what you mentioned about making sure we use tech for good made me want to end our Q&A on a lighter, happier note. So we have just 1 minute left, but I'd love to hear from any of you if you have an example of how the data collection, our online tools, social media have been used for good for our community, and why it's worth preserving what we're building, right? In light of all it, even though there are all these risks and potential harms, why do we keep fighting for this? What are some of the good examples of being used to benefit us?
Okay, I'll start it. I think Spotify's Discover Weekly algorithm is amazing. And so for me, it's been a way to connect with my culture. So, my dad passed away a while ago and never really got me into Rabindranath Tagore, which is a Bengali not musician, but anyways, if you know, I guess. Anyways, so like he has a number of folks, a lot of music out there, which I never got exposed to, right? And so listening to it on Spotify, the algorithm kind of picked up that I was trying to get into more of the kind of classic Bengali like music, and so would start recommending it. And so it was a cool way to feel kind of connected to a piece of my culture and history that I really wouldn't have found a way to, I wouldn't know where to start.
I love that story. Thanks for sharing. And that makes me think about how I've rediscovered my love of K-pop thanks to Spotify, gotten kind of closer to my roots. I guess I'll share one example from our community partners that we work with, but obviously during COVID-19, many of us were isolated, and that was especially true with our elderly populations. But I love that, technology has found ways to bring us together, and there was quite a lot of programming over the summer when students had time off and things like that to connect students with elderly folks. And they are teaching them how to use things like Facebook, how to find like long lost friends on, social media who are back in their home country and things like that. So yeah, I just wanted to share that. And I don't know if either of you have any other positive stories to share, but a reminder that it's not all bleak. And while there's a lot of work to do, there's a lot of good out there too. Okay, I guess there is nothing more for us to say, so I'll hand it back over to the CAPAL team. Thank you to our amazing panelists for such a robust and really helpful conversation.
Thank you, Emily, Tazine, Tejas, and KJ for the thoughtful conversation. Super, super enlightening. Learned so much tonight. And thank you all for joining us today. Before you log off, there are a couple of things that I just wanted to share, important pieces of information. First of all, don't miss our upcoming events. Next Wednesday, we have our next WLP session on environmental racism. How did we get here? And on this session, we'll talk about the uneven impact of environmental issues on communities across the US, and key topics of discussion will address the unequal effects of COVID-19 and raise questions about who gets access to basic resources such as clean water and air, and as well as the prevalence of food deserts across the country. So also please check out our website on how to register and view all of our upcoming programming this summer. Visit our website to learn more about us at capal.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at CAPALDC, and also find us on LinkedIn. So we'd like to take a moment to thank all of our 2021 sponsors, as well as for their continued support in our programs, and helping us to continue to provide opportunities for AANHPI in public service. Initially an all-volunteer organization, CAPAL has served more than 600 scholars and interns and awarded over $360,000 to support public service careers for both undergraduate and graduate students. Our board members, scholars, and interns have gone on to serve as senior leaders across government, from executive, legislative, and judicial branches in federal, state, and local levels, as well as many prominent policy and advocacy organizations. Your valued financial contribution helps expand this work, so please, in order to donate, visit capal.org. We also want to thank you in spreading the word about our scholarship and internship programs. So there are opportunities for undergraduate and graduate students that open up every year in November. So please consider if there are any AANHPI students or organizations who may be interested, and your university career center. So please share the word and spread the word about us. If your organization is interested in sponsoring us, you can contact me, Shama Ahmed, for sponsorship opportunities. And finally, we're also trying to improve our programming to meet the needs and expectations of our community. So after this meeting ends, there'll be a short survey that'll pop up. It'll just take about 2 to 3 minutes to complete. So we really, really value your honest feedback. It'll be extremely helpful for us as we prepare for future programming, and your contribution is much appreciated. So thank you and good night.